Yeah, so welcome back to our conference on shifting narratives. I hope that you already managed to have some interesting talks this morning or listened into some, maybe also in the other panels. So my name is Vera Weghmann. I work for the Public Health International Research Unit at Greenwich University, and I'm facilitating this whole stream today on capacity building in the public sector. And today we have a really interesting panel now on direct labor and direct production. We have actually 6 speakers, including myself. So we have on a very tight schedule as throughout the whole conference. And there were just so many interesting speakers who wanted to speak. So we tried to squeeze it all in, but it is a little bit of a squeeze. So yeah, that's why I don't want to talk too much, but all, and I want to hand over to Rosie, who's doing her PhD actually at UCL with Miriam Planas on capacity building, and will now speak to us on government production. So Rosie, please feel free to share your slides. Thank you.
Hi, sorry, I'm just getting my slides up. 2 seconds. I actually haven't given a presentation online in quite a while. Okay, can everyone see my slides?
Yeah, we can see your slides. Perfect.
Okay, and I'll really try and stick to time. I've been timing myself this morning, so we'll see how this goes. I'm also going to hide myself because I don't like seeing myself while I'm speaking. Okay, great. Okay, I'm started the timer. So thank you everyone, and thank you Vera for organizing this session, and to all of the conference organizers. I think everyone hopefully agrees this has been an amazing conference, and I've certainly learned a lot. It's been really interesting to see all the various kind of threads that are developing around public services, finance, and capacity building. So where are my notes? Okay, yeah, so I'm going to talk to you today about a paper that I have written with my PhD supervisor, Mariana Mazzucato, but this paper is actually not part of my PhD. It's part of a book that we have written that will be published next year that I'll kind of briefly talk about. So yeah, I'm a PhD candidate researching the political economy of public sector outsourcing, and outside of Anglo-Saxon economies. So I'm researching Denmark and Chile primarily. But I've taken a year out of my PhD to work on a book on the political economy of management consulting. So we really use management consulting as a lens through which to look at the broader transformation in capitalism and in governance that has occurred over the past couple of decades since the Third Way. I've also done some other research for some other organizations. So in the context of this paper, we use the OECD definition of outsourcing. So we recognize that outsourcing is different to privatization, they're related, but it's fundamentally the transfer of the production of goods and services that government is legitimately responsible for providing to private actors. So hopefully many of you will have been at June Sakaria's excellent presentation yesterday, so you understood a bit about what we mean by government production. So this is it's a term that's quite widely used, for example, in OECD and in other policy circles, though it's not very widely used in academia or indeed when we talk about the state ever. We still kind of frame this stuff in terms of public sector management or public sector administration, whereas as June Sakaria shows, governments also combine input to provide services, whether they are frontline welfare services or whether they are, the development of policy and administration services, for example. So the kind of premise of this paper is that in many countries, the state continues to be viewed as the legitimate vehicle for furthering socioeconomic interests as defined through democratic structures. Now, of course, it does not always, and some would argue rarely, achieves this in countries even where that is kind of legitimately viewed as its role. A huge caveat to this paper is that although it's a really important issue, we don't cover the mechanisms of democracy and how that affects the state. There's only so much you can cover, and we're really looking at the mechanisms of capacity and how that change state capacity or capacity for producing public value and how that changes and how that affects democracy. And similarly, you know, we don't assume in this paper that there is a kind of normative or foundational or public economy that exists outside of what is legitimately deemed or what is democratically deemed legitimate, recognizing that there is, you know, globally a huge divergence in what counts as legitimate among democratic citizens. And you know, in the spirit of thinking about narratives, I think we might all recognize that normative and perhaps moral critiques of outsourcing and privatisation and of austerity can be hugely valuable and really important for mobilising many people. But sometimes showing why a policy or approach isn't working on the terms set by those in charge of them is also really important. You know, that's something that I think we can take away from the trade unionist Mick Lynch, who many of you might have been following during his media tour over the past week. So yeah, we focus on how the outsourcing of government production affects the ability to achieve what is democratically legitimate as the public interest. And to explore this question, we take as a starting point these debates on public value that emerged in the 1990s and that have continued to be very influential in public sector reforms, public sector management, and have been widely debated, usually viewed very positively in academia. So as far as concepts go, public value, you know, if you're using it as kind of an academic term, it's not a very good concept. Actually, it's very unstable. It's widely contested. Basically, every paper will have on public value will have a different definition. The one that we adopt, although we explore others, is that at its core, public value describes what is legitimately created and sustained on behalf of the public, and in this way is rooted in a kind of relational ontology of public goods, services, assets, resources, and values. So the key policy arenas where public value is created in government include education, health, pensions, and the built environment. Let me just have a look at this. Yeah. Okay, so the historical context of this, of public value theory, you know, studying history is critical for understanding where reform ideas come from, but also to ensure that we don't repeat mistakes, particularly when we're talking about the state and outsourcing and how we provide services. So public value theory emerged within a wider set of ideas that emerged in response to neoliberalism. I think most people here know a lot about the kind of neoliberal reforms that were implemented globally in the 1980s and how they affected the state. So I won't go into too much detail about them here. The third way is often described as a continuation of neoliberalism. And in many ways it was, but in one important way it wasn't. And this is quite critical for us to understand today, I think. So when neoliberalism sought to retrench the role of the state across in the identification of value and in the management of value creation processes and its production, the third way was much more optimistic about the state's potential for both identifying and managing value creating processes. But what it had in common, which is what is very important here, was that it remained ambivalent or often antagonistic about the role of the state in the production of public activities. So this is captured in this language of steering more and rowing less. So this was first published in an influential book called Reinventing Government by Ted Gabler and David Osborne in the United States, and subsequently became a slogan of the Clinton administration, for example, through its National Performance Review, which pledged that the trend among governments to contract service competitively will not be reversed, asserting that by creating competition between public organizations, contracting services out to private organizations, listening to our customers and embracing market incentives wherever appropriate, we can transform the quality of services delivered to the American people. And it was during the 1990s. No, it wasn't actually under neoliberal governments. It was during the 1990s and 2000, during these third-way governments, that outsourcing, that the scale and scope of outsourcing of both frontline services and also these kind of administrative policy services through management consultants really exploded in many countries, including the UK, but also in, for example, Denmark and Chile. So in the UK, for example, forms of strategic contracting, so prime commissioning, prime contracting and joint commissioning really were extended throughout from the late 1990s and 2000s. Okay, I'm trying to go very quickly here. Okay, So comparing then PVT to public value theory to the third way, and showing that it was really embedded in this similar logics. So so public value theory viewed that value is identified through these imperfect processes of democratic government, the accountable public manager, and what they called co-production, which became a very, or is still a very widely used term that actually has very little to do with production, but to do with the design of services, the management of services. How is public value managed? Well, for public value theory, again, it was this accountable manager acting within the authorizing environment, often, kind of under lots of scrutiny as well. Is again something the paper doesn't talk about, some scrutiny from kind of new public management forms of evaluation. But again, like this issue of how public value gets produced, according to public value theory, it was not only changing the size and scope of government, but also shifting the model to one in which government can pay for things to be produced, but not necessarily produce them itself. So I'm not, the kind of main part of this paper, which I'm not going to talk about much here because I'm running out of time, is on why production matters for public value creation. And to make sense of this, we draw on research that we have done before. Mariana Matsukato's background is in innovation economics. So we draw on lots of the literature on learning and production and collective learning to try to make sense of why outsourcing production, public sector production, might also be an issue for state capacity. So fundamentally, this suggests that production is critical for learning by managers. And again, if you're interested in the kind of theoretical and empirical background to this, to these arguments, and I can send you the full paper, or I can also send you parts of my PhD that explore this stuff, but production is critical for learning by managers. So again, this term that is used in public value theory. Those responsible for governing public value creation processes learn through being embedded in production, and that's how they are able to reconfigure resources. It's also a source of learning from learning by doing, so the routines of employees are a critical source of incremental learning and insights for more effectively adapting processes. And then in mission-oriented innovation, but in kind of broader, for example, challenges, what we might call wicked challenges, where actually, states don't have capacity, either because they've been very hollowed out or because they were unanticipated. So for example, with the pandemic, where there is a need to also use markets, use the capacity that exists within markets to create public value, that also requires there to be public sector capabilities, public sector knowledge in order to be able to adapt that. So what does this mean for outsourcing? So this kind of paper and this kind of body of research would suggest that outsourcing leads not only to hollowing out, so the direct transfer of resources, or this one interpretation of hollowing out, the direct transfer of resources away from the public sector, but also stunts the ability to evolve capacity by removing the building blocks of learning that that enable capacity to be adapted. The ability to evolve capacity to adapt is necessary to meet changing needs and demand. Societies are subject to evolving and often Knightian changes in socioeconomic, health, political, and environmental needs and demands. So in a democracy, outsourcing therefore affects the ability of the state to meet future needs. This does not mean that government should do everything, but as democratic bodies, they should retain ability to govern the economy, which requires there to be some production. So that was a lot to pack in for a 10-minute presentation. So I'm sorry if I spoke too quickly or if I missed out parts and it didn't make any sense, but thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you very much, Rosie. That was really fascinating. Rosie, I would like to encourage you to put some of the publications you were mentioning in the chat so that other people can learn about it. And everyone, if you have a question to Rosie already, please put it in the chat, because the way we proceed about these presentations are that we have everybody present first and then have questions, just because we have so many speakers and we would like to give everybody the time to actually present. So we come to Andrew Cumbers now, who has been leading a big project on remunicipalisation, a global project. So please, Andy, share your slides and introduce yourself, because you can do it better than I can.
Thank you, Vera. Yes, I work at the University of Glasgow with a team of researchers as part of a European Research Council project. We're doing work on the global remunicipalisation trend. So I'll be talking about that today, and also the creation of a new database, the Public Futures Database, which we're using really to help activists and trade unionists around the world to kind of share best practice on deprivatisation as it comes up. So I'll just try to share my screen if I can. Is that all there? Vera, yeah?
Yeah, perfect. We can see it.
Good, good. So I've got about 10 minutes, I think, today. Is that right? Or is it even less?
Yeah, 10 minutes.
Okay, great. It'll be a bit of a whistle-stop tour, I'm afraid, through things, but I can put things in the chat, as you say, and we can discuss with people later. So yes, what I'm going to talk about really today is this kind of global trend towards deprivatization and how we basically see that as a kind of part of the failures and crises of neoliberalism that people have been talking about today, and the real attempt to sort of recreate forms of public that actually really are about tackling social needs and demands rather than being driven by sort of private profiteering. So what exactly is remunicipalisation? Well, it is a global trend, the way we define it, around the world since 2000 for cities, towns and subnational territories to take formerly privatised services, assets and infrastructures back into public ownership. So what we've been doing as part of our ERC project and a kind of spin-off project as well is we've created a public futures database, which you can see, we've got the link there, with our partners at the Transnational Institute and the Public Services International Global Trade Union Federation to identify cases around the world where remunicipalisation is actually happening. What we always say when we talk about the database is we recognise that this is a kind of activist created. It's quite a new method in a way. It's an activist almost kind of crowdsourced database of cases that we know about within our networks. So it's an incomplete database. It's changing, it's developing, and we're quite clear about the kind of problems with it as well as the potential that it has in terms of helping the wider pro-public movement. And we're very keen on the database being as robust as possible, because at some point we recognise that our enemies out there in the corporate sector and the privatisation sort of discourse will probably come after us at some point. So we're very keen to make this database as robust and coherent as possible. So if you go to our website, you'll see that there's quite a detailed methodology on what we can say and what we can't say about the database. But essentially, it captures deprivatizations around the world. It captures these at national, regional, and local levels. And in the database, we include both returned assets and services that are going back to forms of public ownership, but we also list new public enterprises that are largely created out of market or privatized sector failure as well. Now, I'm not going to talk too much about our conceptual and theoretical kind of engagements with this phenomenon, but I think what I would say very, very briefly is that we do situate remunicipalisation within what we think are a series of crises, contradictions, and in the ongoing mutations of the neoliberal governance project and its various geographical dimensions around the world. And I think particularly since the period 2007-9, the financial crisis, it's quite clear that neoliberal governance is in a period of profound failure and contradiction. We don't think it's the end of neoliberalism. I think that we've heard various speakers at this conference already suggesting that the way that neoliberal thought, particularly at the higher level, is still really powerful and something to fight against. But nevertheless, we do think that its emerging contradictions are kind of manifested and accelerating and leading to a call for the return of the state and return of the public form. And we talk about that in a series of papers in different kinds of ways. So I think we would say that for us, remunicipalisation is part of this kind of critical conjuncture of neoliberal crisis and failure. And there's two graphs that really illustrate that, I think, quite well. The first graph here on the left of the screen shows that although privatisation as a project goes up and down over time, if we look at it since the 1980s, it's been a continuing trend to try to privatise state assets and resources, to introduce market forms to allow private profiteering. But on the other hand, on the right-hand side of the slide, we can see that actually, despite all this, the share of government, the share of the state in most economies, particularly in the developed economies of the world, continues to increase, whichever indicator you look at. And this is just an example from using government debt. So I think there are sort of counter tendencies that we can see out there in global political economy at the moment. And again, for us, and I've highlighted a few writings, I think, which you can follow up, and I can put these in the chat. For us, I think there's what we call a set of spatial incongruities between the abstract global project, pushed by the likes of the IMF and the European Commission still, about what the right policies and governance mechanisms to tackle some of the problems that society faces, and what we call the stubborn multi-scalar territorial political economies of everyday life, which actually mean that, when we see privatization or outsourcing coming in the public sector, it inevitably ends up in failure and crisis to deliver, even in its own terms. So for us, remunicipalisation is the kind of terrain in which some of these incongruities are kind of playing out, and the site really of struggle. Not so much the return of the state, but a kind of reconfiguring of relations out of the crises and contradictions of neoliberalism. So, as I say, what we've done is we're trying to map this process of remunicipalisation around the world. We're doing various case study countries and more qualitative-based research, but I can give people details on that later. But essentially, our database really picks up on this developing trend since 2000 for if you like, more and more municipalities, even at the regional level, regional governments, to take back privatized services into forms of public ownership. I think it's quite remarkable how diverse this phenomenon is. If you look at it, we've recorded so far about 1,582 cases in 69 countries across 12 sectors, and even within those sectors, we can differentiate between 96 types of service that have come back into public ownership. And I think the thing we would say here is we're pretty sure that this is just the tip of the iceberg. We're actually, this is just the kind of what we're able to record through our activist networks and our trade union networks. So we're always looking for new sources, new people to come on board to give us even more information and data. And particularly in these parts of the world, like Africa and Asia, where we don't really have the networks we think we need to really record this phenomenon in the way that we'd like to. If you look at the geographical spread, we can see that remunicipalisation is probably greatest in Western Europe and North America. We also see it in the global south, perhaps the epicenter is Latin America. And I think the very simple reason that I can give you for that is that it's these countries and it's these regions where you perhaps saw the most widespread forms of privatization, particularly in the 1990s. It's less so in Africa, but I think there's a developing trend to try to perhaps privatize more and more public services there. So I think, again, there's kind of continuing battles between private and public that are evident in some of these trends around the world. If you look at it across sector, it's clear that water was for a long time the dominant sector, particularly in parts of the global south, but also in countries like France and even North America. And it's there that, if you like, the pushback has happened first against privatization. And similarly in the energy sector, there's been a massive pushback against the privatization of energy infrastructures and services, particularly in countries like Germany, which has seen a massive growth in sort of deprivatization cases in the last few years. So energy and water have been the leading sectors to date. In the water sector, France and the US are the key epicenters. But I think we've also seen an interesting growth since 2010 in new areas, particularly in healthcare and social services, where very often it's a reaction against the outsourcing of critical services. We've seen massive instances of failure, whichever country, whichever context you're looking at, and now there's been a real effort, if you like, to deprivatize and introduce new forms of public services, sometimes where they don't exist. A really interesting recent case is the growth of community and public pharmacies at the local level in Chile, for example. And we've also seen quite a big trend in the UK, but also in Spain of local government insourcing, particularly since 2010. And there's an interesting relationship there between the kind of austerity politics and sometimes local governments where they have the power, seeing that actually it's cheaper and more beneficial if they bring things back in services. And then we also see some other interesting trends. The renationalisation of the rail industry in the UK is something that's kind of commented on a lot in the public debate at the moment. Another interesting trend has been the growth of broadband and telecom public services in the US, particularly at the local level. And we see also other areas that we can kind of categorize it quite interesting developments happening. So what are the motivations behind this trend? I think it's fairly obvious. It's to do with the poor performance of privatisation. If you look at the graph in front of you, quality of service provision is usually given as the highest reason for why local authorities take things back into public ownership. Cost reduction, though, is another one, and perhaps the third most important objective is just the desire of local politicians to really take vital assets and infrastructures back into public control and put them under some kind of democratic accountability. So just to conclude very briefly, I think what we would say broadly about the remunicipalisation phenomenon is that I think it really is a lens through which to look at neoliberal contradictions and crises, and the kind of in the more narrow terms of the whole privatisation debate. It's a lens really to highlight privatisation's failures. And I think this is quite interesting because what we see, I think a few of the papers and the speakers that have already talked today and yesterday have highlighted, we still see a continuing kind of marketization, privatization agenda at the highest scale, particularly through the IMF and the European Commission with its desire to complete the single market project. These are still quite critical agendas at the highest scale, but they increasingly, it seems to us, don't deliver at a lower scale when it comes to important social, economic, and political policy areas and issues. I think one of the worries that we have as a kind of pro-democratic set of activists and academics committed to a much more democratic and transparent public sector is that actually, as privatization fails, we might see the return of a much more managerial or the return to a managerial state that we had in the past, which corrects for market failure, but seeks perhaps to privatize or marketize when the opportunities come up, and doesn't have any kind of commitment to a more citizen-engaged set of public services. But I think if you look at the various cases that we're finding in the database, I think we also see that a lot of the activists and actors at the local level behind remunicipalisation campaigns are attempting to evoke very different values around public service, collective provision, social and ecological needs. And then the final thing I'd say is that through our involvement with really establishing this database and working with different movements and activists around the world, I think on a hopeful level, I think there is this kind of pro-public research and think tank based set of initiatives and movements that have built themselves up over the last 2 decades that I think potentially can be very powerful in articulating a different narrative, but also drawing upon our own evidence and our own data to really sustain and build that narrative. So I think that's the point I would finish on, in the sense that we do have this incredible pro-public movement out there at the moment, which brings together academics, trade unionists, NGOs, and so on. So I think there's a real opportunity in the current crises, the current multiple crises that we have, that come out really of neoliberalism in whichever policy area, climate change, the pandemic, public health, or whichever area you look at. There's a massive opportunity now to bring some of the knowledge, information and data that we've been assembling, and really begin to develop very, very effective counter narratives as we try to push a much more pro-public democratic agenda. Okay, I'll finish there.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Andy. That was fascinating. Yeah, it's a very packed panel, but it's a great way to really share our knowledge here at this conference, what it's all about, to connect across the world. So please, yeah, like you said, put the publications you mentioned in the chat. There is also already a question to you in the chat. You can answer that, or hopefully later when we come to around the question. And next is Miriam Planas. We hope that her mic is working. Miriam has been really on the front of privatization struggles of water in Spain, and now is in the left government of Barcelona. So Miriam, yeah, please talk to us about water and sanitation system in Spain, specifically Barcelona.
Thank you, Vera. I'm gonna share my presentation. I hope you can see it.
We can also hear you very well, so that's a good start.
That's great. Can you see it well?
Yeah, we can see your presentation. It's not on slideshow yet.
It's not? Okay, then let me change the, I have two screens and is it now? Or
yeah,
not?
perfect. Perfect.
Yes, now it's on. Okay. So thank you for.
So we can see your notes as well, actually. So actually, it's not. Actually, it would be better if you.
Okay. Sorry, I have two screens, and this is.
The first one was good. It's just I think you need to click the slideshow button on the top of the screen.
Is it now good?
No, now it's still. It's again. We can see your notes, and we can see it only quite small. But
okay.
how you did it first was really good, and
I
then
think
only you need to slideshow.
It should be working now.
Yeah, perfect. That's great.
Okay.
Well done.
I'm a bit nervous because English is not my native language, so I'm sorry if there is anything that is unclear or you need more explanation. Please write it down. Thank you for inviting us to present the proposal that we've been developing from the water movement in the metropolitan area of Barcelona. This is a system of performance indicators proposal for urban water cycle services with environmental, social, economic, and gender sustainability criteria. This is an idea which was born from the water movements, and it has been developed in collaboration with Engineering Without Borders, Ecologists in Action, and with the collaboration of the City Council of Barcelona. And the idea is to introduce into the evaluation and the system of performance indicators of other dimensions of the water. Which we believe this is something that should be done in all other public services, because what we find when we look into performance indicators, it is only seen from one or two technical points of view. So the idea was to include the other points of view that we have from the social movements. This work has been developed and prepared by a working group with participants from different disciplines such as engineers, lawyers, environmentalists, which has provided a more plural view in these different several fields. And it is worth to highlight the work that was carried out by the Terrassa Water Observatory in first place, and which was materialized in a report called Proposed System of Indicators for Water Transparent Management in Terrassa, and it was made in 2020, where the principles and objectives were defined for the 7 topics that we will evaluate and analyze in our study. Finally, several students have also participated in this work through educational cooperation agreements for academic internships and master theses. They are, you can see them in the screen. The presentation will be centered in the motivations, the objectives, the context, and the process of elaboration. And I won't be entering so much because in 10 minutes we don't have the time to talk about the concrete proposal, because we would need like 1 hour and a half to do so. But I hope that it's enough to to bring it into discussion, the need to develop this type of indicators. First of all, the motivations that bring us to start this work were the need for public community control and social empowerment, arising from a lack of information, a lack of transparency, and a lack of participatory spaces in water management in Barcelona, and also kidnapping of the government of water. So a lack of ability to govern the water management system in the metropolitan area of Barcelona by the public administration. And all this is due to a delegation of the water management system to the multinational Akbar Suez, which now is Veolia, which has been going on for 150 years in the city of Barcelona. So the idea of this indicator system proposal is to have a tool to provide accountability for the governments, and which allow us to monitor and control the plan of compliance according to the mission, functions, and social objectives and environmental aspects that we set up. It must have the participation of all the administrations, and the citizens should be involved too. Also, this indicator system should be working together with a water observatory that we are working to shape in order to have some feedback between the two tools. Which is just 2 minutes of context in the metropolitan area of Barcelona. I don't want to go into the water so much, but there is a need to understand why we need these indicators. Climate change crisis has already been named in the Congress several times, but this has this makes that water is going to be less and less available. And on the other hand, we have a model of urbanism in the city of Barcelona, the metropolitan area, which is increasing the demand of water. So the context and the politicals go in different directions, and we need tools to make decisions that go together. In the sanitation aspects, we have pollution of water surface, groundwater, and coastal water bodies, and we didn't find a lot of indicators in the sanitation aspect of the water system. And we think this is because there is no economical revenue, so it is no important to analyze what is happening with sanitation, because it only affects the environmental impacts. On the other hand, we have a solution which is being provided by the public administration, that is regeneration, which from the social movements, we believe this is only bringing to have more profit for the public, for Akbar Suez, for the private operators, because they are going to be managing this type of solution, and we need to think of other alternatives too. The fourth aspect of the context is the lack of government, I already explained, and the private management. And the fifth is the human right to water and sanitation, which we've been tracking its warranty for the past 10 years. And this has allowed us to develop a lot of criteria that now we believe can be included into this proposal of indicators to be able to be expanded and adapted to other contexts, and have the ability to analyze which is the degree of compliance of the human right to water and sanitation. In this human right to water, in this human right, also what we see is that gender is a risk factor, which needs to be addressed also when we are analyzing what happens with the water system. And finally, the environmental implications that have the supply of water in Barcelona, which has direct impact in Catalan water ecosystems regarding quality and regarding quantity. So this needs to be addressed too. The objectives of the work were first of all to develop a research on reference documents already existing and studies on water cycle indicators and all related dimensions. Second, to develop a criteria methodologies to make aggregate indicators which allow us to communicate the system of the indicator system. And third, to develop a proposal of indicators on compliance with the human right to water, which is an essential aspect to us, also for democratic quality of the system, the impacts on water aquatic ecosystems, also having into account the economical quality indicators. And the most innovative aspect we believe we've included is these gender indicators that I was explaining before. After having developed a proposal for all these areas, we have also developed a proposal of in the aggregation of these indicators, as I was saying, to be able to communicate later to citizenship. And also another objective was to open a process to negotiate the proposal with the responsibles of the public administration and link the development of these indicators to the creation of the Metropolitan Water Observatory. I will skip the process, but it's because we don't have the time, but it has been a very long process. It's been almost 2 years. First of all, we gathered and invented, created new indicators, and we have a first proposal of almost 700 indicators. Then we had to make a selection, and finally we have 200 indicators. Just for you to know, the private operator has a system of 1,000 water performance indicators, which we don't have access, and neither the public administration has access to that. And these 200 final indicators have been aggruppated in these 7 thematic areas. First of all, gender perspective, which is a block, but it's also transversal to the other blocks, to the other areas, and the definitions of the urban water cycle, the compliance with human right to water, democratic quality of service, environmental, economical, and quality. I will only go through through 4 of these areas very quick in 1 minute, because they are the ones which the manuals and the reports usually skip, no? Which are the gender, human right to water, environmental impacts, and the democratic quality of the service. And just an example, in the area of gender perspective, it's in Catalan. I'm sorry, I didn't translate, but I think more or less you will understand. There are 13 indicators which are aggregated into 4 sub-areas, which is equity in governance and management, economical equity, equity in participation, and conditions for equity. And inside these sub-area indicators, there are 3 which are aggregated in these blocks. These allow us to be able to communicate in an easy way. No? In the presentation, you see these kind of drops of water with different colors. So the idea is to be able to go from a technical analysis which allow us to evaluate the performance to an easy way to communicate and be able to evaluate the evolution of the water system. And I had the other aspects, but I think I will jump into the conclusions because I am out of time. So the future steps for this report and this system of indicators is to start negotiation with public administration, because they also have developed in the metropolitan area of Barcelona a system of indicators, but they only have looked into the supply system. And they have not included, of course, nothing about participation, democratic quality, gender, human right to water. So the idea is to open a negotiation to be able to include these aspects, and also sanitation, which was not included either. Also to develop an implementation plan, because there is a lot of work still to do. We need to set up which are the values of compliance of this indicator, which is a very hard work. There is also a need to know where this data can come from, because some data is local, another data is from the Catalan government, another data is from the metropolitan area of Barcelona. So there is a need to coordinate and to have all this data, and finally to develop a plan for communication, because this is an important aspect to us, how to link with citizens in order to explain what is happening with the water system, more than farther than the price of water. That is the thing that they can see every month, the price of water and the taste of water, but they don't see what is behind all this water. So as a final conclusion, we believe this approach is globally valid under the appropriate adaptation to different contexts and different public services. We talk about human right to water, but we can talk to human right to health or other human rights. Also to include the gender perspective when we're looking into the public services and the environmental impacts. And we believe this set of indicators, together with other politics and other measures, can be useful in changing approaches to water systems management or other public services management. I will leave it here. Thank you very much. I hope it was clear.
Thank you, Miriam. Very clear. Yeah, it's very interesting to hear all these details and the practical dimensions. So yeah, please share whatever you have. I think the study is not yet publicly available, is it? But maybe you can share information how we can keep up. And yeah, great. I see already that in the chat, everybody is sharing information and talking to each other. This is really great, also because we have such limited time for questions only. I will shoot on with a next presentation. Great, can you see my slides? I hope so. No one is saying anything, but you should be able to see my slides now. So yeah, perfect. Okay, thank you. So this is, I will be presenting also very quickly. I will put my timer on now because we're so short of time today. Project, which is almost a little bit counter what Andrew has been presenting about. So I'm looking at more privatization tendencies within central governments this time. And this is a research which has been commissioned by EPSO, so the European Public Service Union. And I should also just really quickly spotlight myself so that you can see me while I'm presenting. Sorry. So this, yeah, so the study is commissioned by EPSO, and the idea behind the study has been that often when we looked at privatizations or indeed remunicipalisations, we have looked at public utilities and local government, while we haven't done so much on looking at central governments and specifically looking at civil servants. So this is what this research is about now. The study, we aim to have it launched by today, but it's probably coming out within the next month. So it will be published very soon, and then we will share it with you all. So just really briefly, the context is that we have seen, and we have talked about this already today and yesterday, a lot of restructuring of the state. The study focuses on Europe, and we've seen a lot of changes due to privatization and outsourcing. And I will look specifically at as consulting now. We have seen that more and more responsibilities from the core function of the state have been given to more private sector involvements, often through very complex arrangements. And basically anything of any government task can be outsourced, if it's ever so small. So just to name just a few examples, we've seen that some governments in Europe have outsourced the knowledge gathering on employment statistics. We have seen increasingly, we see audit functioning outsourced or done by private consultants, and also a lot of policy making. So we really see the privatization of policy making, where private consultants, often by the very same big firms, are making policy suggestions. This has all been based on a theoretical approach of new public management. This is sort of this neoliberal theory behind it all. It has been going on for, like I said, already 40 years now, but it got very much intensified by the financial crisis in 2008. And we also indeed see that the austerity measures which followed the financial crisis led to more consultancy, and I will explain this a bit further in a minute. And also now in handling the COVID pandemic, we have also seen that a lot of outsourcing and indeed consultancy work took place during that time. So I will skip the slide on theories on new public management, but I just wanted to include it so that later on when we share the slides, you have it. But basically the idea which we can keep in mind of new public management approach is that this state should become more like a business, because then it will be more competitive and therefore more efficient. And this new public management paradigm really spread across the world. So consultancy we can see has grown a lot in Europe and also globally. It's a form of privatization, and the idea is really that external expertise should be recruited and in order to facilitate also institutional change. So private consultants contracts are different to outsourcing in the sense that they're more short-term and often for very specific tasks. So it's smaller and usually short-term contracts. However, in practice, we see that these short-term contracts are not so short-term, because the same consultancy firms are repeating the task all over again. And often these very same big firms are the same throughout Europe. So like I already said, we see a very big rise in public sector management. We can see that from all public sector management consulting, like 14% of that turnover was in public management consulting, and we can see that this is almost like a brain drain in the public sector. So we see that as we had more austerity measures and staff has been cut, they have been replaced by private consultants. So in a way, the more we cut staff, the more we need consultants in order to fix this gap. And in the pandemic, we have also seen that a lot, that private firms have been tasked with the handling of the pandemic. So just a quick check, because there's lots of ideas about consultancy. We actually see something very different. So the idea is behind consultancy is that they're like independent, people with independent expertise. It's neutral with very specialized knowledge, and in order to have more access to a wider knowledge, we should not have like a civil servants on a permanent job doing it, but always look for the knowledge where it's there. However, this knowledge is not so neutral as it might seem. So there's lots of research out there which shows that actually we can see almost it's like a consultancy addiction, that that consultancy always leads to more consultancy, and the advice consultants give is to involve the private sector more. So it also leads to more and more outsourcing, for example, because consultants are more likely to advise outsourcing procedures. So here we see the interlinking of different forms of privatization. And in the same time, the more we go to consultants, the more we will lose the capacity of the public sector to actually have and develop that knowledge. Often it has also been done on the back of austerity in order to save costs. However, it's a bit of cooking the books, because actually consultancy workers are much more better paid and much more expensive than in-house civil servants. So even though it then, you know, comes on the back of on the back of austerity, it's actually it's actually a contradiction there, that they are much more expensive. And I already talked about the capacity loss of consultancy. Okay, next slide. I just want to, in the last 3 minutes I have, give you a few examples, because it's always good, you know, when we talked yesterday also about the narratives of public services, we talked about how powerful examples are to actually see what's happening on the ground. So the UK is leading, it might not surprise many of you, but the UK is leading in terms of the consultancy sector. It's the largest consultancy sector in the world, actually. And it's now estimated to be worth of 11.3 billion. And this was up 77% from the previous year. So it's not only really large, but it's also really growing tremendously. And this is how this links back to what the literature refers to, this consultancy addiction or consultocracy, where we see a lot of action. And sometimes these contracts are actually not so short anymore. Remember, the idea was that consultancy is very short term, but for example, the UK Ministry of Defence signed a 6-year-long contract with a leading consultancy firm. So, you know, it's almost like an outsourced contract where the contract period is quite long. In Germany, I want to mention as well, because in Germany also consultancy is rising tremendously. And that's again interesting when we think about what Andy has been talked about earlier about remunicipalisation and other counter trends in Germany, where we see a move towards more public ownership again. We see that inside the central government, even though there have been very interesting examples, which I'm not going to mention today, but they're in the report about capacity building and almost remunicipalization of consultancy in the German state, we still see an increase of consultancy work, so an increased privatization of the state. And just an example, in Germany, where this became very obvious, it became known as the Berater-Affäre, and this was under Ursula von der Leyen. So when she actually was the head of Ministry of Defense, and in Germany, obviously she's known to everybody by now, and she really turned the Ministry of Defense around and tried to do it a lot through more consultancy work, brought in McKinsey, and within a very short time, it was impossible to distinguish actually who was a civil servant and who was a consultant from McKinsey, because they all had government email addresses, they had signatures with the German armed forces. And what was interesting is that these consultants then passed on other consultancy contracts to their mates in the very same consultancy firms, and sometimes also other consultancy firms. So this became known as the buddy system. And again, where it's very much shown that consultancy leads to more consultancy first and foremost. Okay, and I need to almost stop my presentation here because as a chair, but I just really quickly want to relate to France, where we also have seen a lot more consultancy. and especially under Macron, even though it already started under Sarkozy. But it's interesting that through the pandemic, there is a very little opening of seeing that now, like, because there were so many scandals, that the government actually said that it will not automatically give, and that also tells you a lot, not automatically give contracts to private consultants, but is trying to actually reduce consultancy. So an interesting counter trend within it, going to more and more consultancy. I skip my next example and come to the conclusion, but the report will be out shortly, so you can find all the examples in the report. Actually, I didn't have a conclusion because I ended on the examples, but yeah, so please get in touch if you have, if you're interested in this topic. Yeah, I hope that I can share the report as soon. And now I stop my slides and introduce the next speaker because now I have to go back to my facilitation role. But please, if you have any questions to me, yeah, please just contact me. And Osmond, now it's your turn to speak about remunicipalisation again. So going back to maybe a more positive note. Yeah. Thank you very much, everybody.
Okay, thanks. Can you hear me properly?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, great. Just making sure. So just give me a sec. And are my notes showing up, or is this fine?
No, we cannot see your notes. We can just see your slides. Perfect.
Okay, excellent. Okay. So just give me a sec. So thanks for the opportunity to speak about remunicipalisation in Australia. So everyone, I'm the Senior Policy and Research Officer at the Community and Public Sector Union, and the part that I work for represents public sector workers at the federal and territory level in Australia. Before I properly begin my presentation, I wanted to acknowledge I'm on the unceded land of the Wadawurrung people and pay my respect to elders past, present and emerging. So my presentation will highlight why Australia should be of interest to remunicipalisation researchers by providing an overview of our history of privatisation and trends in remunicipalisation. I'll then finish up by focusing in on two comparable case studies to reflect on the causes of remunicipalisation in Australia. So there's been growing global interest in remunicipalisation, but one of the big gaps has been on Australia, as research is often focused on North America and Europe. There's a few reasons why I think we should look at Australia more closely when it comes to remunicipalisation. I think one key reason is Australia's interesting political economy, a developed economy and one of the 20 largest economies in the world. Australia, as we know, was founded through invasion and the dispossession of its First Nations inhabitants, beginning with its establishment as a convict settlement in 1788. These origins meant Australia, as we know it, uniquely began as a command economy, and the state has played a significant developmental role ever since. Australia also has a federal structure that was established in 1901 that allows comparisons between jurisdictions. So similar to the United States, the federal government has limited constitutional powers. The remainder left to the states in the division of powers that mean they're often the provider of public services. And I think finally, Australia was a pioneer of neoliberalism in the Western world. So while there's a lot of focus and knowledge on neoliberalism under Thatcher and Reagan, far less well-known globally is the Australian example. So Australia was led by the centre-left Hawke Keating government from 1983 to 1996, the longest-serving federal Labor government in Australia's history, which helped to construct neoliberalism in Australia. It cut taxes, deregulated, corporatised and privatised, despite having a formalised accord with the trade union movement. Despite this history, even now, Australian Labor is arguably the Western Social Democratic Party with the strongest trade union influence at a party institutional level. And in many ways, that Hawke Keating government can be seen as a precursor to the Third Way. Now, before looking at remunicipalisation, it's important to understand the extent of privatisation in Australia. So amongst OECD countries, Australia ranks second behind Great Britain in terms of the absolute size of privatisation proceeds occurring to national governments in the 1990s. and measured on a per capita basis and relative to national GDP, Australian proceeds from privatisation made it a world leader in the field. So covering the Labor and subsequent Liberal national government, there was an estimated 68.3 billion in federal assets sold. And beginning in 1990, Labor privatised a range of government-owned companies, including the airlines, the federal government-owned bank, Serum Labs, and amongst others. It was defeated in 1996, and the subsequent Conservative government doubled down on that privatisation agenda. Now, the privatisation agenda wasn't limited to the federal sphere, with the election of radical free market governments in multiple states in the 1990s. The division of powers meant that a lot of infrastructure and state-owned enterprises were actually owned by the state government. So things like electricity, banks, rail, ports, insurers, and gaming monopolies. These free market conservative governments were elected in landslides, but only held power for about 2 terms after implementing aggressive privatisation agendas. But even after being dumped and replaced by Labor governments, those Labor governments didn't try to completely reverse those policies and even continued with privatisation. So it's estimated that over $100 billion in assets were sold by state governments over this period. There has been a shift whereby privatisation is now seen as politically toxic in Australia, and that's been felt by both sides of politics. Now, I thought I'd just quickly share this chart just so people have a sense of privatisation and the waves that occurred in Australia. And you can see the peak of privatisation in the 1990s by the Commonwealth, Western Australia and Victoria. But we also see more subsequent waves in more recent years associated with attempts to privatise electricity in New South Wales and Queensland. So while the story of privatisation is well known in Australia, one thing that's far less well known is the story of its reversal. So many on the left in Australia wishfully desire to return, the banks, airlines, and telecommunications to federal public ownership. But what's missed are instances of remunicipalisation that have occurred at the state level over many years. So in trying to raise awareness of this, I've been working with the Transnational Institute to catalogue these examples in the database that Andy mentioned earlier. Now, remunicipalisation itself can be contested. So for definitional clarity, I am including state governments just because of how Australia is governed. And to date, nearly 50 cases of Australian remunicipalisation have been added to the database. So from it, there's a few clear trends. So the healthcare, energy, transport, prisons, water, and local government are the most common sectors where it has occurred. And also we see examples of public hospitals and related services being brought back into public control in every single Australian state. Notably, we've also seen a shift of Labor away from the excesses of neoliberalism that it had in the 1990s and 2000s. Labor has primarily overseen these remunicipalisations and other more pro-public policies, though it also still occasionally does go around privatising things. So in the research on remunicipalisation, a key debate has been about its causes. It's a simplification, but broadly speaking, there's a debate about whether the causes are more political or pragmatic. So as part of further research I've been conducting, I've been looking at particular case studies in Australia to get a better sense of its causes. And as I mentioned earlier, Australia's multiple jurisdictions allow some comparisons that enabled us to get some insights into remunicipalisation. So based on criteria, I've been examining Port Macquarie Base Hospital and Mildura Base Hospital. They're 2 similar cases of build, own, operate public-private partnerships in regional Australia that were returned to public ownership. So Port Macquarie was the first private for-profit hospital in Australia. It was established as a part of a wider neoliberal push by the New South Wales government in the early 1990s. So there was strong community opposition despite it occurring in a rural conservative seat, and it only barely got through as the Conservative government lost its legislative majority and there was nearly legislation that stopped it before contracts were signed. Following its opening, there were reports about cost blowouts and poor contractual arrangements that were the subject of government inquiries, and there was quite contentious local politics. So for example, the local council held a non-binding referendum, and also the incumbent state MP quit the Conservative National Party to become an independent state MP. An attempt to on-sell the hospital by its private operators led to the government intervention and a buyout in 2004 by the Labor government. So similar to New South Wales, a radical free market government in Victoria sought to apply the same public-private partner models to Mildura with a 15-year contract. Again, there was strong community opposition and a wider backlash with the election of a Labor government in 1999, but not before the contracts were signed. Around the 15-year mark, a local community group started campaigning for a return of the hospital to public ownership. The then first-term Conservative government extended the contract for another 5 years, but brought back the facilities which were under different ownership. The subsequent election led to a change of government to Labor and the election of an independent candidate who campaigned on returning the hospital to public ownership. Following that, the hospital operations were brought back under public ownership at the end of the contract extension, despite the private owners wanting to continue the contract. So while these two examples means it's hard to extrapolate more widely, it provides some insights. It does show that both political and pragmatic factors were at play and related. Contracts are a key site of contestation and often the catalyst for reversals of privatisation. The attempted sale in Port Macquarie and the contract renewal process in Mildura drove action by government and citizens' movements. Pragmatic factors like cost and quality drove dissatisfaction, but there was also the citizens' movement, local political contestation, and a social democratic government that acted. All were necessary, key actors and events interacting. One interesting element from an Australian perspective is the public service provision outside of major cities, especially at healthcare, as there are no other options. These two examples are in rural Conservative seats, very far from the major capital city interstates, where an independent became the local state member at the expense of the traditional Conservative Party that usually wins the seats. And finally, I think it's clear that having a social democratic party in power mattered because that's when it occurred. The centre-right Victorian government had an opportunity to bring back the hospital into public hands, but instead chose contract extension for Mildura. Okay, so that finishes my presentation, and hopefully that very brief overview of history and trends prompts some further interest in Australia.
Thank you very much, Osmond. And we're actually staying now in Australia for our last presentation. So yeah, Hannah, would you like to share your slides and basically add to what Osmond has said? And then hopefully we still have probably 10 minutes time for questions, but please again put the questions in the chat or exchange contact numbers and so on. Thank you.
Awesome. And I'm just going to do the same thing and make sure that my screen sharing works. Sorry.
Okay.
Share screen option. Sorry. Sorry, I'd had the share screen option up throughout the time I've been online.
It always happens, and it should be at the bottom in green.
Okay. Sorry, now I've turned off my camera. Oh, there we go. All right, I'm going to share screen, and then yeah, hopefully this will all work. Here we go. Oh, sorry. Got to come up. Desktop 1, maybe, or Safari. Maybe that's it. Is there anything sharing?
No, not so far. We can't see anything.
Not yet. Okay. Oh, share. There we go. Sorry about the disruption.
No worry, it just happens.
Google Chrome, that's it, isn't it? It's thrown up. I'm sorry. It's thrown up a few sharing issues for me. So is it all right if I'm sorry, I'd put together a huge thing. It had photos of delegates and everything. So I was really excited to show it and it was going to be a big deal. Anyway, so I'll push on because time is of the essence.
You can just talk to us about it, or if you want, you can email it quickly to me and I will share it.
Awesome, thanks, Vera. So my name's Hannah Gassane. I'm a member of the union that Osmond works for, the Community and Public Sector Union. I work in seniors policy in the ACT government, which is a territory government in Australia, and I'm a proud CPSU delegate there. Right now, I would be showing you a photo of CPSU delegates out the front of one of our buildings handing out for bargaining. And so we work in the Community Services Directorate. We've got a really great CPSU delegate network. A lot of us, we work in community services. So our directorate delivers like the public housing, social housing, the child youth protection services, and also a suite of like policy and service design work, which is what I'm involved in. I work in seniors policy, and we have family policy on disability and family violence and programs around those areas as well. So in the CPSU delegate network, a lot of us have worked in the community sector, are very close to the community sector, and that kind of thing. So I'm just setting a bit of a scene there because I'm talking today about a statement or a draft paper that CPSU delegates have been drafting in the Community Services Directorate, which is related to two processes that we are undergoing within the Community Services Directorate. One is the process of commissioning, which CSD and also ACT Health are undergoing, and it's sort of a move from the kind of just plain contractualism and just contracting with the community sector, and it's moving from that to sort of doing more co-design work. I'll just read the ACT government definition. CSD and ACT Health are reforming the way the ACT government works with community organisations to deliver health and community services. The commissioning for social outcomes process is a deliberate departure from contractualism. That's how we're talking about it. Instead, focusing on a collaborative, this is ACT government, integrated partnered approach to delivering and procuring services. So very often our directorate in discussions with the community sector will talk about how we work in partnership. So while our directorate has been engaging with community sector leaders for over a year now in the commissioning process, at a recent meeting with community sector leaders where a few of us delegates were observing, there was a presentation on the insourcing framework that is coming into the ACT government because our union has advocated really effectively to have an insourcing framework, which will basically mean before any privatisation or outsourcing decisions are made as part of that process, a public interest test will be applied and public service provision of that service or policy thinking will be considered. And we observed as CPSU delegates that community sector leaders were threatened by that and saw that as a threat to commissioning. They saw it as antithetical and completely contradicting this whole commissioning process. Whereas CPSU delegates, we thought commissioning was about partnership, wasn't it? And it wasn't it about actually public and community working together effectively rather than us just outsourcing all of our work into the community sector. And so in fact, one of the community sector bosses said, we will not subscribe to a CPSU agenda. And so it got quite hairy in that meeting. And I will note that the community sector union wrote in the chat, because it was an online meeting like everything is these days, said we support the insourcing framework. So from the community sector workers perspective, it was a little bit different from how their bosses were playing it out. So what we wanted to set about doing was we're working with these organisations every day. So we wanted to sort of say, as CPSU delegates, but also as community sector, as community services directorate workers, we think that these are complementary agendas. And so in our delegates chat, we had a brainstorm. Why are these complementary agendas? Well, because if you want to have a strong if you want to have strong partnerships with the community sector, you have to have capacity in the community services directorate. We have to have right now, our jobs are very much about just doing outsourcing, doing contracts, not thinking, not being able to be responsive enough, not being able to partner in meaningful ways. So that was the number one sort of argument we wanted to make. And the second argument we wanted to make was that actually we do draw the line in some areas, and particularly when it comes to statutory functions that our government directorate is responsible for, they should always be delivered by government, and there's no ifs, ands or buts. So we wanted to make those two statements in this process. So I've basically just explained the whole process. With the few minutes left, I'll just sort of go through quickly the preamble, a little bit of the points we made about how we need a strong public sector to partner with the community sector, and then a little bit around the statutory functions work. So in the preamble, we basically wanted to set the scene and say, you know, as CPSU delegates, we think community services and community service organisations are vital to civil society and our democracy. There's a great value in community organisations in building trust, representing diversity, and ensuring community-led and controlled solutions is that's unequivocally valuable work. Funding for community organisations to deliver human services should adequately reflect the true value of the work. Decisions to outsource that are rooted in the pursuit of savings fall far short of a holistic assessment of how policies, programs and services should be delivered to best meet the needs of the public. It should also be acknowledged that perceived savings are invariably carried by workers in the community sector. On the whole, insourcing and commissioning are complementary and mutually reinforcing reforms to strengthen human services. And there are critical areas within CSD where outsourcing is not appropriate and the government cannot relinquish responsibility, namely statutory functions, in particular child protection responsibilities. So the insourcing and commissioning for social outcomes to us are two sides of the same coin to address the transactional and competitive contractualism and marketisation that have plagued human services for decades. Both agendas are mutually reinforcing and complementary in addressing the legacies of new public management. New public management has crowded out questions of service quality and community need in favour of efficiency and cost benefit while hollowing out our public service. Commissioning is therefore a much needed reset in the design, delivery and supply of human services and programs, as well as the social policy settings which shape them. A report which was done to inform the commissioning process, which was called Counting the Costs, outlined that commissioning promises more cooperative and networked forms of government to create space to jointly determine need and responses. So commissioning signals a shift to a more relational and less unilateral way of government and community partnering, embedded in shared values and shared responsibility. This shift necessarily entails strong capacity in both public and community sectors to undertake genuine co-design. Commissioning therefore issues a challenge to the public sector to break out of the constraining contract manager mould. Growing out of this restrictive mould should see the public service resume responsibilities and capacity for research, policy development, service design and delivery, and monitoring and evaluation to inform human services policy, programming and services. This will enhance the government's ability to effectively partner with community organisations. Together, both insourcing and commissioning provide a rich opportunity for public servants to shift from mere contract mechanisation and administration. This in turn could reinvigorate the meaning and impact of the work and motivation of public servants. In relation to rebuilding the strategic planning and service competencies within our public sector, the Centre for Policy Development has posited that commissioning involves a suite of viable, innovative alternatives beyond outsourcing and requires higher investment in public sector capability connected with service design, delivery and accountability and the way they interact. And then we point to some examples within our own directorate, like we've got a family safety hub, which is very much based on having a strong policy capacity within the public service and in really investing in that and their partnerships with the community sector. I know I'm fast running out of time. We do have a dig at consultants saying that actually commissioning and insourcing. And one example, I worked in the Office for Women. We had a consultant report years ago, and it just didn't, it was because under pressure and with limited capacity, that's what you do. You go to a consultant and you get them to do the time limited report, and it just wasn't that useful because it didn't have the local knowledge and it didn't have the context. So what we ended up doing was having a partnership between me and the Office for Women and co-designing with people in the community sector, and we produced a report together. So we make that case to say actually commissioning and insourcing together provides these kind of opportunities rather than just going off to consultants all the time. We also make the point that outsourcing obscures the true cost of a service. And so we think the closer, when you alienate public servants from frontline service delivery, there's no one knows how much things actually cost to deliver. And so we get away with underfunding services. So we make that point as well. So that's it around partnership. Of course, in child protection, we heavily reference a report a few years ago, which was the People's Inquiry into Privatisation. And PSI was involved with this. It's a great resource for people on the line today. And it comprehensively looked at a whole range of privatisation projects, and including child protection. Basically that report found that one of the impacts of privatising or outsourcing in child protection is just inconsistency across services being one issue, but blurring the lines of responsibility, and that it's such a wicked and challenging policy area that politicians kind of like outsourcing there because it just creates blurred lines of accountability. One other point we make in that area about, you know, the government needs to maintain a role in this area of child protection is that there's a real, in New South Wales, a neighbouring state, there's been a real trend towards outsourcing in the area of child protection. It's one of the most outsourced child protection systems in the country. And a report from their, a New South Wales parliamentary report said, government is a last resort provider. And so we challenge this idea that that governments have become this really residualised service provision where in case of emergency break glass providers, and it really is emblematic of an overall retreatment from broad-based, accessible and universal services. And it also accepts creaming as a responsibility in that community sector services can take the people who are easier to provide services for, but government will always have to be there for the people who have the biggest and most challenging issues. So that kind of sums up. There's a little bit more there, but I don't have time to go into. Basically, our recommendations, this paper is, we're putting it back to the minister responsible and also CSD management, because they're the ones managing these relationships with some of the cranky community sector bosses, is that we want to challenge outsourcing as the default and basically put the option for public service provision back on the table, better recognise the role of the public service in partnered and shared service delivery, and then retain and protect the current role of existing role of the public service in essential human services within our directorate. And basically we don't want to go backwards any more than where we are now. So yeah, that's the summary. I'm so sorry about the slides. I promise I put a lot of effort into them, but technology always bites me. But yeah, thank you so much for the opportunity.
No worries. Thank you, Hannah. That was really good to hear from, the voices from the ground, really. Because in all this, in this conference, we really tried to bring together academics and trade unionists. So I thought it was very insightful to have both perspectives here today represented. Unfortunately, I mean, it was to be expected with like 6 amazing speakers, and I didn't want to stop you because everything was so interesting what you were saying. I don't really have time for questions, but I did see that lots of questions have been raised in the chat and so on. I would like to just allow 5 minutes going into the break, just in case someone has an urgent question or wants to say something, make a comment. Otherwise, I really recommend that you are still in touch with each other, change email addresses and keep up with the debate as well. point. Maybe, hopefully, this could even lead to further collaboration between some of the people who were here today. But is there someone who wants to say something, or any comments, questions to be raised on this topic?